The X-Men movie franchise is one of the most iconic comic book movie franchises of all time, running from 2000 to 2020, spanning 13 different films. It's a franchise that has meant so much to a lot of people and changed how comic book movies were perceived by the public for decades to come. On one hand, there's so many great movies, characters, and well-executed ideas that will stick with me for a very long time. On the other hand, there's a lot of bad ideas, baffling decisions, unnecessary retcons, and plot holes that make this quite possibly the sloppiest cinematic universe ever put to paper. It took me basically my entire life to actually sit down and watch most of these films because I had grown up hearing how awful a lot of them were, and even before I started, was warned how bad this series of movies would actually be. Coming out of it, do I regret watching all of these movies? No. Sure, there were some absolute stinkers, and I will get to those, but there were also some of the greatest comic book movies of all time, which is why today I've decided to rank every single X-Men film. This is just my opinion, and I know for a fact I have some controversial takes, but this is a place to be open-minded. So let's be open to discussion and let me know your rankings down below. At number 13, I have X-Men Apocalypse. I know most of you would have something like Dark Phoenix or Origins Wolverine or The Last Stand here, but for me, Apocalypse is definitely the worst. For starters, this movie is a sequel to Days of Future Past, a movie that I believe could have and should have basically ended this universe. This means that characters like Charles are infinitely more stupid than they were in Days of Future Past. Magneto goes through the same tired character arc he's been going through since X2, but on an infinitely more boring and uninteresting way. I mean, seriously. How many times is this man gonna have someone he cares about die so he can go on a murderous rampage and then be defeated or talked down at the last second?
You betrayed me.
No. I betrayed them.
It's just getting old at this point. Apocalypse himself is an incredibly boring villain with a pretty awful design. I know Oscar Isaac is a very talented actor, but his performance as Apocalypse was pretty lackluster, although that was probably mostly due to a very poor script. The X-Men lineup here was also just kinda weird. Like, Mystique is back, and for some reason she's the leader of the X-Men, and now there's new versions of Jean Grey, Scott, and Nightcrawler who all don't quite get the focus you'd want or expect from them. Oh yeah, and don't forget they tried to recreate the incredible Quicksilver sequence from Days of Future Past, which I'll say is the best scene in this movie, but it just seemed like a desperate attempt to recreate the magic from actual good films. All in all, to stop this from being too long, I find this to be a very boring and uninspired sequel to one of my favorite comic book movies of all time. This is a 1 out of 10. And at number 12, I have Dark Phoenix. Now, before going into this movie, I had read the Dark Phoenix comic, which was absolutely incredible and showcased perfectly to me why people love the X-Men. This movie has literally none of that. For starters, this is their second attempt at the Dark Phoenix arc, and once again, it is completely rushed. They don't even get the Phoenix origins correct, which is already a really bad sign. Jean, in this one, also has little to no personality besides constantly repeating, "Oh, I'm gonna hurt someone." They try and create all this artificial tension between the team as well, which gets most egregious when Mystique just flips out on Professor X after they save some people from space because he didn't go there personally and help them, and drops the single most awful line in the X-Men franchise, completely missing the point of the actual meaning of X-Men. Magneto goes through the same arc he did in the last 4 movies where he finds out Mystique dies and once again becomes evil and tries to kill Jean Grey. At this point, the franchise was completely overplayed and clearly they had no idea where they were going. Quicksilver, the best part of the previous 2 movies, was also completely written out in an utterly ridiculous way. I also wasn't a fan of many of the performances in this movie, as most characters seemed like they were just kind of done with the series, and I can't blame them. This movie gets a 1.5 out of 10. Not gonna waste any more time on it. Number 11, I have X-Men Origins Wolverine, which is just a conceptually bad film. In X2, we basically got all we needed of Wolverine's backstory. This one doesn't even really answer anything new or that you'd want to know, it just creates a lot of plot holes. I know this movie has been completely beaten to death by the internet, but I will give it one thing. It is so over the top in thinking it's badass that I kinda enjoy this one in a weird way. The story and characters are all over the place. It visually looks worse than the original X-Men, which came out almost a decade before this film, but at least it stays fun bad for the most part. Side tangent as well, why have Gambit in this movie if you never planned on using him for the rest of the franchise? Absolutely stupid, as he is one of the coolest X-Men, and we were robbed of getting a good version of him on screen. Oh, and the final battle with Deadpool is awful. but I couldn't stop laughing. Never have I seen a movie get a character so fundamentally wrong. First of all, his mouth was sewn shut. You know, the merc with a mouth. Secondly, he has discount Wolverine adamantium blades, which is like the dumbest thing ever. And thirdly, he shoots laser out of his eyes. Yeah, no, this movie is really bad, but entertainingly so. If you turn your brain off, you might have a decent time with this one, which I don't really think applies to the two below this. I give it a 3 out of 10. Now the Wolverine comes in at number 10 for me. I know this will come as a surprise to a lot of people because they might have it a little higher or have other movies lower, but this movie did not vibe with me at all. Hugh Jackman, as always, puts on a phenomenal performance and is undoubtedly the best part of this movie, just like he was in Origins, and some of the action sequences are also phenomenal, like the train scene, but that's about where the positives end for me. The plot revolved around this Japanese family of characters that I never really cared about, a villain that was completely flat for me, and a setting I honestly found boring. A movie with Wolverine in Japan, without his healing factor, struggling with PTSD from the last movie on paper, sounded amazing to me, but it just wasn't. Now, moving on to number 9, I have New Mutants, which is another controversial opinion. I enjoyed this one a whole lot more than I was expecting to. For the longest time, I heard how awful this movie was, so I went in with very low expectations, but I was pleasantly surprised, though, when I enjoyed this film. For starters, the premise was intriguing to me. I liked the whole concept of these mutants being tested on and coming face to face with their deepest fears via the power of the main character, even though it was kind of underexplored. I also enjoyed the 2 leads, Rain and Danny, and I thought the other 3 mutants were pretty decent to good as well, especially Anya Taylor-Joy as Ilya. I thought she was very entertaining. Dr. Reyes was a good enough antagonist for this movie as well. Nothing too special, but I didn't mind her. My one big problem is the finale being a massive CGI fight with a bear demon, which completely went against the rest of this movie being a character study on grief and overcoming your trauma. And the pacing was also pretty all over the place. So while I like this movie more than others, there are certain glaring flaws with the tone and the pacing that hold this one back for me. Now at 8th, I got a lot of people's least favorite X-Men movie, The Last Stand. The plot in this movie is absolutely terrible as it tries to rush the Dark Phoenix and Cure storyline into a sub 2-hour film. This causes both ideas to be incredibly half-assed. Jean Grey was also pretty bad in all of these movies, but this movie, she at least tries to put in her best performance, which isn't saying too much because she's basically pretty heavily overshadowed by Magneto. Which brings me to why I have this movie so high up. In every sense of the word, this movie was a blast for me to watch. I watched it with my brother and we were laughing non-stop at the cringe dialogue, the awful decisions, and Ian McKellen's incredibly over-the-top performance as Magneto. That's really it. I had a great time with this movie. I'm not defending its quality because for all intents and purposes, it's a pretty bad movie, but it's a bad movie that I love and have a lot of fun with. Now at number 7, perhaps another hot take here, I got X-Men First Class. I actually do really dig this movie now, but in my other controversial opinion, yikes, I'm getting absolutely cancelled for this video. I did not like X-Men First Class too much on my first watch. I found a lot of the movie kind of boring with James McAvoy's Professor X and Michael Fassbender's Magneto as the clear standouts in this otherwise meh movie. However, after I watched Days of Future Past and revisited a lot of this movie, I started to really see the appeal a lot of people have for it. It's an awesome take on the origins of the X-Men with great characters and a fun, albeit kind of bland villain portrayed wonderfully by Kevin Bacon. The slow build as well of Magneto and Charles' relationship slowly souring more and more over time was so good, and that ending was amazing. Honestly, it being this low is a testament to how much I actually enjoyed a lot of the movies above this. Definitely check this one out if you haven't already. I don't want to spoil too much else here. At the 6th spot, I have the original X-Men film. When I first saw this movie, I could see why people would have enjoyed it back in the day, but found it unremarkable for today's standards. However, the more I sat on it, the more I really missed this film. For starters, it's one of the earlier films that kind of kickstarted the eventual comic book movie craze that really began with Iron Man in 2008. Brought us the likes of Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, who is one of the most iconic live-action heroes of all time, Patrick Stewart as Professor X, which is just perfect casting, and Ian McKellen as Magneto, which I adore with all my heart. The themes as well in this movie are amazing, with the conflict between mutants and humans portrayed incredibly well. The plot here is simple, if not a little goofy, but I think it really works and sets up an incredibly nice sequel. And speaking of that sequel, And breaking into the top 5, I have X2. This movie takes a lot of the elements from the first movie and expands upon them in a great and natural way. The themes are better, and the plot is more interesting. The main characters, except Cyclops, my god, these movies did him so dirty, were all more fleshed out, and overall, it was a very great film. The action here was also great, in particular, the Wolverine versus Deathstrike fight, which was a very entertaining action sequence. The little we got of Wolverine's backstory was also great and interesting, and the villain was actually really good here, as he was a big enough threat to bring our heroes and villains from the first movie together, providing a lot of fun dynamics and interactions. Yeah, I really don't have too much more to say about this. It was just another great film that was very ahead of its time. Deadpool comes in at number 4, and I have always loved this movie since first watching it. For starters, around when it came out, I hadn't really been watching comic book movies besides The Dark Knight and the Raimi Spider-Man movies, so it was completely new and fresh to me. I found the movie absolutely hilarious and thought Ryan Reynolds was an amazing Deadpool. What do I think now? Well, I kind of already spoiled it, but I still love this movie with all my heart. Ryan Reynolds is irreplaceable as Deadpool. No one else could pull off the charisma of Deadpool so perfectly. The side cast is also very strong in this one, with Colossus, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, and Vanessa being great in this film. The villain is a bit generic, but I feel in a movie like this, they don't really need an outstanding villain. Overall though, this is an incredibly entertaining and fun movie with great jokes and good action sequences. The only real negatives I'd give are some of TJ Miller's jokes are forced and completely drawn out, but that's really just a nitpick. Now, Deadpool 2 is number 3, and most of what I said about the first Deadpool movie kind of applies here. I just find the jokes stronger in this movie, and the additions of Cable and Domino absolutely sold this one to me over the first. Cable is the perfect straight man to bounce off of Deadpool's non-serious nature, and Domino is just a really fun character. Add in Juggernaut as a badass villain, and all the characters from the previous movie being just as good as they were before, and you have a perfect sequel in my eyes. More of what you love, just better. Can't wait for Deadpool 3, I'm just sad we won't see Cable return. Now my runner-up is X-Men Days of Future Past. This is a comic book movie that is perfect to me. This movie builds tension like no other. I was on the edge of my seat this entire film. The beginning sequence showcasing the Sentinels wiping out the last of the mutants despite their best efforts and teamwork was so effective to me. Then you get both sets of cast, with Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen reprising their roles as Charles and Magneto, and in my opinion, putting in some of their best performances as those characters, especially Ian McKellen, who had some incredible standouts in this film. You also get James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender, however, absolutely stealing the show for me. James puts in the performance of a lifetime as a down-in-the-dumps Professor X who's lost his way, and in a great reversal of roles, Logan has to be the one to help guide him back on a better path. Michael Fassbender, though, steals the show completely for me as Magneto, with all the scenes being near perfection. Michael Fassbender, though, is an absolute megastar in this movie, with all of his scenes being near perfection. I was so tense during the Trask execution scene, where he tries to kill Mystique and just everything is going wrong, and the final sequence where he drags a stadium through the sky towards where Trask, Mystique, Charles, and Logan are, which leads into the final battle, is so incredibly perfect to me. I couldn't end this section as well without talking about the final stand with the Sentinels, which was absolutely heartbreaking, watching our heroes fall one by one, or Magneto telling Charles he wishes that they didn't spend so much time fighting, which is the perfect cap-off to their relationship, or the best scene in this movie, where James McAvoy looks into Wolverine's mind and sees Patrick Stewart, and they have a heart-to-heart conversation. It's also perfect, and if you haven't seen this movie, please do. It's a masterpiece to me, and I give it a 10 out of 10. My top spot, and one of my favorite movies, not even just comic book movies ever made, is Logan. This movie is a grounded and gritty take on death and how it affects people. Wolverine coming to terms with his mortality and using the last bit of his life to take care of Charles and X-23 is so inspiring, but equally heartbreaking. I don't want to spoil too much of this movie because I urge you guys to watch it. It made me nearly sob multiple times as it wraps up the story of Wolverine and Charles perfectly. I'm so mad that I waited so long to watch this movie because it really is everything I've ever wanted from this franchise. Patrick Stewart puts in a phenomenal performance as a broken down Charles Xavier who's so mentally far gone from where he was, it hurt to watch. Daphne Keane was perfect as X-23. and her chemistry with the other two main characters is so good despite her barely speaking until the last third of this movie. The fight scenes are raw and visceral, and for the first time it really feels like we get to see the brutality behind how Wolverine fights and kills. The ending as well, without spoiling anything, is done to absolute perfection, and I doubt anyone will leave this movie with dry eyes. This is an 11 out of 10, and it stands as not just one of the best comic book movies ever, but just an outstanding movie. Now, whether or not you guys agreed with me, I think it's safe to say this universe is overall a mess. While it has some of the highest highs in comic book movies, it also has some of the lowest lows. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Thank you so much.